I can just give you some assumptions that I make, just in general, that will be part of what informs me and how I will deal with some of these questions. This is not to say that I'm right or wrong, but these are just the assumptions I make. And the one assumption for me is a very important one, and that is that I'm simply not inclined, this is my personality, I'm simply not inclined to work on anything that's not a problem for the people I'm working with. Period. It's just an assumption I make. And I make that assumption for a couple of very important reasons. If it's a problem for me, then why am I seeing them? And if it already is a problem for me or a problem for somebody else, why am I not seeing somebody else instead of them? I just have found that people that are not there working on something which is a problem for them simply don't work. And much of the trouble we get into in therapy is because of that very issue, that we end up working with people around things that are not a problem for them. It's a problem for somebody else, or a problem for a certain definition. And most people that I've ever run into are simply not inclined to work on something that's not a problem for them. Now, that's not just a simple solipsistic or nihilistic answer. I have hardly ever run into people who don't have a problem they're willing to work on. And I think that's the cutting issue here. It's how you define the nature of the problem and how the problem emerges. The second assumption that will inform some of my responses to these questions has to do with the very language I'm just using about whether or not there is a problem. And I have a problem with that statement I made. I really don't think in terms of problems as being fixed entities. I think one of the difficulties we get into with our traditional diagnostic schema is it defines problems as having a certain space and form and position, and that you have to know what it is, like a cancer, kind of like a psychic cancer or a systemic cancer, and you need to discover it and excise it in some way. And I simply have a totally different view. I think problems, like everything else in life, are always on the way. They're always changing. They're never the same. And the purpose of therapy at the beginning is not to discover a problem, it's to begin to have problems emerging that will always be changing as you're talking about them. They simply don't stay the same. And I think that's a hard one to get out of our head, that there is a problem and that we have to come up with a solution to the problem. The minute you fix a problem in space, then you have for every problem a right solution. But if problems are fluid, ever-changing issues, solutions are not a factor. Problems change, disappear, emerge, dissolve, but they're always in motion. A lot of stuck therapy is because we whip dead horses. And dead horses don't get whipped very easily. At least they don't get motion very easily. So one of the assumptions I make is that there's no such thing as a problem. And of course that gets into the question you asked about assessment and other things, which is all based on that philosophical notion that there is a problem for us to discover, and having discovered it, to come up with a solution. And we can talk about that. But that's one of the assumptions I make. So those for me are two very important assumptions. And have a lot to do with how I think about things. A third assumption I make, which for me is very important, has to do with the whole use of the word therapy, which I have gotten to dislike very much. The word therapy has certain assumptions which bother me. The word therapy makes some assumptions about who's responsible for what. Therapy means that you are the fixer of things. And I think that's a very dangerous assumption to make. I would basically describe this assumption, or this broad arena of assumptions, that, you know, in our field, I think there's a long history, a long tradition of thinking of ourselves as therapists, as psychologists, as social workers, as psychiatrists, to think of ourselves as experts in producing change. We are change agents. I don't believe it. I think the only person you change in the therapy room is yourself. I think it's impossible to change somebody else. And that's for me, a very important assumption. Now, I can interact with people such that they will consider changing, but I can't change them. And I think a lot of the questions that are in here cut across that assumption. And we can talk about that from many different aspects, but I believe very strongly that I cannot change another person. I can coerce another person. And that sort of gets into the fourth assumption, I think, for me, the big difference between, as far as I'm concerned, social control versus coercion, or versus treatment, social control versus treatment, is that social control can restrict behavior, and that's all it can do. But it can't change behavior. You put somebody in jail, you can stop them from doing something, but you don't change them. That's why the prisons don't work. Treatment has as its goal maximizing the opportunities for changing behavior, not restricting behavior. And so the assumption I make about treatment is that the end result of treatment is unpredictable. You cannot predict what will happen in therapy.
Do you sometimes say that to the client? Say these things consciously to them?
I could think of a situation where I might. What I would say would depend on the context, but I wouldn't ordinarily make a big point of that. I think that's probably said, however, in the way I respond. I think, for instance, what these people we saw on the television yesterday were responding to was that very message. That I was not trying to make them do anything, which gave them the opportunity to want to do some things themselves. So I think that message was said, but I didn't ever say it. It was said in terms of how I approach them. But I think for me, those assumptions kind of underlie a lot of what I think about. And then a last assumption I make, and I think this is a very important one, and a very difficult one. Most of our, let me put this a little differently. Most of our experience with the world, most of our training, most of our education, most of our cultural heritage, these Anglo-Saxon cultures that we're part of, is based on a general philosophical proposition that there is an objective reality, that we can know that reality independent of our observation. And it's out there, and we can control it and we can manipulate it. Our sciences basically, over the last century, perhaps century and a half, have been sciences which are based on the assumption of having a certain knowledge of an objective reality, and have held out the promise that we could, as scientists, control that objective reality for our very idealistic position, that we could use our science to control nature, and in controlling nature, bring us the beneficence of a utopian society. I think we are at the end of this century of certainty. I don't think that's possible. I think the solutions we've come up to in terms of how we've understood reality have produced problems bigger than the problems we started with. And I would use as an example of that nuclear war, for instance, or Afghanistan, or the wheat shortage in Russia, or other such things. I think we are beginning to enter a century of uncertainty in our sciences, and you see evidence of this in biology and physics and in other basic scientific theories. We are beginning to understand that you cannot separate the observation from the reality. and that the only reality we can know is limited to our capacity to observe. And that may not be what reality or nature is all about. And that our methods of observation determine the realities that we can operate in. Which means that we are, as scientists, as knowledgeable people, forced to deal with our ethics and values and their role in determining our observations. And this means that the question, the underlying question that we must be able to solve for ourselves, and we don't yet have an answer to this, is how can we permit our values and our ethics to become part of our science without those values destroying the science? I think that's the big question that we have to answer for ourselves. And I think an assumption I make is how to play with that notion in trying to understand the work I do in therapy. So those are the assumptions I'm coming from. I would think that, and these figures are very loose, I'm not sure